Before we get going, with me is Mary Ann Conboy, no stranger to the committee. She's our capital budget coordinator at MMB, as well as Assistant Commissioner Jen Hassemer, who's Assistant Commissioner and responsible for the debt management for the state. So we're happy to be here. Today I'm going to go through a couple of things. One, I'm going to just give you a quick overview of the capital budget process, discuss the growing needs for infrastructure, talk about projects and how they were updated from 22 to 23. Provide an overview of the governor's infrastructure plan, and then finally just walk through the capital budget financing so you understand it. So it should be a good overview for the committee, good introduction. What we intend to do is then follow through with individual and more specific discussions of agency recommendations, so you get a feeling and understanding of the strategy at each of the agencies. This will give you an overarching understanding of how we got to this point. So let's start with the overview of the capital budget process and these recommendations. It's a significant process. It is not an accident that these proposals get to you. It follows a lot of work from people within state agencies and local governments and MMB, as well as the legislature. MMB collects information for the capital budget following a statutorily defined process, which is open for agencies and political subdivisions whose capital projects are generally eligible for general obligation bonds. Requests are developed in odd-numbered years and published with the governor's recommendations in January on even-numbered calendar years. So the process is all facilitated by MMB. This is all a process that's set up in Minnesota statute. This slide just gives you a reminder of the work leading up to last session, when we were normally sort of expected to look at and review a significant bonding bill. After MMB opened its capital budget system to receive requests, we hosted Q&A sessions. We provided instructions and assistance to agencies and political subdivisions as they submitted requests. The governor, lieutenant governor, MMB, we all went on bonding tours, even in the COVID time, across the state, conducted meetings and reviewed projects. And we also took in other just sort of more informal input. The governor's public comments survey for local projects got 778 comments, all received by the fall of 2021. When developing these recommendations, projects were evaluated on factors such as matching funds, if the project is ready to go, how urgent the project is, and alignment with the governor and lieutenant governor's One Minnesota vision, including a more equitable Minnesota. And in 2022, January 2022, about a year ago, these governor's recommendations were all published and provided to the legislature. Unfortunately, as you all well know, no bonding bill was enacted last year, so we're back. And it's for a very important purpose. There's a growing demand for infrastructure in our state. In this last process, nearly $5.5 billion of requests were received from state agencies and political subdivisions. $5.5 billion. This is 10% higher than the total requests just 2 years previously, and did not include projects that weren't submitted through the MMB process. So the total number of projects is even greater. Since project information was last collected statewide to prepare for the 2022 budget, it is also important to consider how these project costs and updates change over time. So we're going to go to the next piece, which is the recommendations. Really, the list of projects is the same as what you saw last year with only a few minor changes, but the costs have changed. That delay in the time is important. Inflation has been a challenge to the construction industry, and the costs of building materials, labor, and construction increase. All of those costs have increased over the last year. When requests are submitted through MMB, they select whether to include their own inflation estimate or whether they're asking MMB to utilize our own internal inflation schedule. If they do that, then we will include those and adjust the governor's recommendations accordingly. MMB asked agencies with their 2022 recommendations, did the timeline change as well? Because that delay also impacts when they can start proceeding. Did the scope change? And did inflation impact costs? For those who used MMB's inflation schedule in 2022, we factored in the project updated midpoint of construction costs, applied that to a new inflation schedule developed with professional construction management firm. So just in case you're wondering, it's not like me or Mary Ann sat in the back and tried to figure out what's the CPI. And this is a management firm that deals with these costs in great detail. For those who updated their inflation estimate in 2022, we asked for their updated costs. This information was reviewed and included in the governor's recommendations. So in short, the governor's recommendations accounted for inflation and were specific. It wasn't a generalized inflation cost, it was specific to those particular projects. We found that in average, the project's midpoint construction was pushed out a year because of the delay in the bonding bill, and with that factored in, total project costs are now just about 20% higher. I'll take you to the next slide then, if there's no questions. We'll be walking through the governor's infrastructure plan at a high level.
Commissioner, Representative Erdahl has a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Commissioner Showalter. First of all, I did miss you over the weekend, and hope we can. We've been talking fairly often lately, and one of our topics has been inflation. And just for the edification of those listening to this, you said the inflation rate for construction is 20%. Would you help us out by how did you determine 20%?
Commissioner
Yes.
Showalter.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, Representative, great question. And I mentioned, we got basically a construction management organization that deals with a regular basis projects, trying to understand at a specific level how materials and other things would be changing. Some costs go higher depending on the project. That may be a bigger factor or maybe a lesser factor. In other places, it might be labor or site preparation. So those things all vary by project, so we adjusted each individually, but on average, it's about 20%. So as you go through them, you'll see that some projects are more than 20% and others are less.
Representative Erdahl.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and Commissioner Showalter. Thank you for that. There have been no questions about it, so I appreciate your clarification.
Representative Lilly.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and Commissioner, on that 20%, what are you finding? Is it labor or materials, or do you have a sense of what the 20%, what are you finding right now? Because
Commissioner Showalter.
Great question, Mr. Chair. Representative, I'll start and I'll hand it over to Mary Ann Conboy, who's been working on those specific information. Certainly materials has been a big cost because we're seeing that impact across the board, but I'll let her go into a little bit more detail.
Please identify yourself and proceed.
Mr. Chair, I'm Mary Ann Conboy. I'm the Capital Budget Coordinator at MMB. And yes, we have, in consulting with a construction management firm, it's labor, it's construction materials, and it's also construction equipment that have all increased in cost. And those three factors are developed into a specific adjustment made for Minnesota's construction economy.
Representative Lilly.
thank you, Mr. Chair. That's great. Thank you.
Please proceed, Commissioner.
Thank you, Chair. So on this, I'll start just walking through the governor's infrastructure plan. As I said before, this will be at a high level. We'll go through specific recommendations with state agencies as we go through further. The 2023 recommendations mirror the 2022 recommendations in terms of projects and programs included. A small handful were removed just because of the updated information from the requesters. EV charging infrastructure funding moved from the operating recommendations to MnDOT. And as mentioned before, updated project costs were included. Grant programs and asset preservation programs funding were increased by 20% in order to provide funds to accomplish roughly the same work that was included in 2022. On the next slide, you see here the governor's infrastructure plan of being $3.3 billion on all funds and is summarized into 5 major categories: asset preservation, community and equity, housing and homelessness, environmental stewardship, and roads, bridges, and water systems. I'm going to walk through these categories in the coming slides. A unique aspect of bonding bills is how funds for programs and local projects also are just one piece of the puzzle. We sort of talked about this on the side in previous years as well, that overall, the governor's $3.3 billion infrastructure plan is estimated to leverage an additional more than $2 billion in other funds, such as federal funds, local funds, and private funds for investments in these projects. So while these recommendations are important and critical, it is also just recognized that this is even a greater investment in Minnesota, that the infrastructure would grow by more than the $3.3 billion we're recommending, by more than $2 billion of other participants on these projects. In the governor's recommendations, most of the matching funds for the federal infrastructure are coming from the IIJA, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. But a lot of those recommendations are in the operating budget, not in the materials that you see before you here. One essential component is in the capital budget, and that's the $41 million that's included in the PFA recommendations. That's for the state's clean water and drinking water revolving funds. The amount decreased from last session due to updated estimates from the PFA, and this $41 million in GO bonds will unlock $92 million in regular EPA funds and $206 million in IIJA funds. Also in this presentation, as we move along, MnDOT will discuss some potential IIJA impacts not included on this table.
Commissioner, before you proceed, so looking at the graph, the note says that for the capital budget's 91 million, and so where's the other 50? And I'm assuming is that the trunk highway bonds, and would that be in transportation then?
I see.
Yeah.
I'm reading the subtotal.
The transportation on the operating side, yeah. Mr. Chair, great question. You almost caught us. It is the $41 million that you see on this table, as well as the $50 million in transportation funding that's on the operating budget side.
Thank you, Commissioner. Please proceed.
We've got that, nearly 40% of this recommendation package, it really is directed towards fixes and improving existing facilities through asset preservation programs and renewal projects. I think members of this committee, this is no surprising theme. It's a majority of it's a major priority, and it's just a consistent theme of these capital investment bills. Looking at the asset preservation funding alone, in the 2020 bonding bill, which was the largest ever enacted, only $169 million went to asset preservation programs at the state agencies or higher education institutions. So even as we get larger bills, asset preservation remains a smaller or a modest fraction of that amount. This recommendation from the governor includes $646 million in asset preservation recommendations. In addition, it introduces general fund cash for some of its funding, which gives agencies more flexibility than GO bonds, and allows them to do things like building automation or security systems in their asset preservation projects all at one time. More funding and consistent funding are really needed for asset preservation to keep up with the backlog. We build new, but then we need to keep taking care. And right now, state agencies have a deferred maintenance of about $1.9 billion. Minnesota State's higher education institutions estimate that they have a backlog of $1.4 billion on top of the 1.9. And on top of both of those figures, the University of Minnesota has an estimate of $2.3 billion of backlog. So the asset preservation needs are real, they're significant, and obviously they impact the quality and useful life of our assets. The next slide just reminds you.
Commissioner, I think to asset preservation, Representative Lilly.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Commissioner, you just triggered a question. So based on us not passing a bill last year, what is this? How much more is it going to cost us, like, to do the same projects? Basically, is it? Do you have an idea?
Commissioner.
Mr. Chair, Representative, I don't have a great estimate. Perhaps Mary Ann does, but I think the obvious answer is construction costs and R&R would cost an estimated 20% more. But also, when facilities get in worse condition, then the costs also get worse. So as Commissioner Roberts Davis will talk about in her presentation on administration, the more we allow facilities to get into disrepair, the more expensive it is to bring them back up to a sort of accepted levels.
Representative Lilly.
Thank you.
Representative Hansen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and Commissioner Showalter. Do you see some of the asset preservation, we've got consolidation of staff going on where there may be fewer needs of our building infrastructure. does some of the asset preservation go towards maybe upkeep and then closure, or essentially disposal or disposition of buildings, like selling them off or providing them for housing, or I'm just thinking of the massive number of buildings we have around the state, and is there any plan there for, because having an empty building, it could deteriorate quickly.
Commissioner Showalter.
Mr. Chair, Representative, wonderful question. I'm going to give you a brief answer, and I am pretty sure we're going to go into a more significant follow-up when the Department of Administration is up here, because they just completed a master plan, looking at our assets and trying to understand really sort of how we might deploy office space and other facilities, and thinking that through a multi-year process. So your question about consolidating, using our space differently is exactly where the conversation is at. I can speak as a commissioner of my own agency. We're in the midst right now of consolidating space, trying to figure out how to shrink our footprint, use space differently, and I think that's going on across the enterprise. It's not going to be an easy or fast answer because of the number of constraints, including leases and multiple, ownership of spaces. But that said, we're definitely underway.
Please proceed, Commissioner.
So I want to just, I sort of already made this point, but it's just like asset preservation, besides sort of the financial reasons, we touched on it right already, is that it's just it's the right thing to do. And it's also just more expensive as you delay. And so I mentioned in the previous question, but this gives you some of the numbers of how it works, that over time the costs vary depending on the condition of the building. And so it is a factor for Minnesota, it's a factor for all public entities, and it's one of the factors that we discuss with our rating agencies when we talk about where's Minnesota, how does our bonding program work, and really what are we using these bond proceeds for. Moving ahead, there's a number of other themes in this recommendation that includes community inequity, which is about 16% of our total recommendation. And while every project in this recommendation will have positive impacts on local communities, this category highlights many of the projects that are requested by local units of government and benefit communities across the state. About $290 million of this is for projects like community centers and public spaces and public safety facilities in cities, towns, and counties. In addition, about $12 million is included for local governments, nonprofits, and tribal governments to construct and renovate early childhood facilities. And the governor's recommendations also dedicate a historic amount to equity, with a $200 million set aside to evaluate and select projects in the capital investment bill. On the next slide, about 14% of the recommendations for housing and homelessness. Housing infrastructure is just critical, and it's really a critical factor that the governor's recommendations continue to target. $250 million of this proposal is for housing infrastructure bonds, be used as a statewide resource and really address the shortage of affordable housing units. The recommendation also expands the use of housing infrastructure bonds to support the construction of multifamily rental housing for households with incomes at or below 50% of area median income, AMI. That varies by county, so as you know, that may be for a household of 37,500 to 52,800, depending where you're at for 3 people. But it's an important metric for access and making sure that we can really address needs across the state. In addition, $60 million is included for public housing rehabilitation to preserve existing public housing and keep it safe and healthy for residents. And ultimately, there's $100 million in cash for housing infrastructure and $20 million for public housing rehab. Those are in the operating recommendations. Also included in this plan is $84 million for emergency shelter facility grants to local and tribal governments and their nonprofit partners. The next slide highlights environmental stewardship, a theme that comprises about 10% of the total recommendations. These are investments that conserve energy and invest in affordable renewables. Some examples of it are $12 million for a state building revolving loan fund to agencies to finance energy efficiency and water conservation improvement projects. Another $6 million for state building renewable energy production accounts that incorporate solar and wind and other renewable energy systems. And they also make investments to adapt and prepare for increasingly extreme weather events. That would include $20 million for DNR's flood mitigation grants to local communities. That helps really construct levees and other infrastructure that reduce flood risk that costs more later. $24 million for PCA's local government stormwater construction grants. This is infrastructure not currently addressed by the PFA. And these recommendations also help Minnesotans just be better stewards of the land that we call home. $12 million for grants to local governments for composting and other programs. $37 million to fully fund the capital assistance program projects for counties that address solid waste and recycling facilities, and more. Going further, roads, bridges, water systems, additional parts of our infrastructure system are about 20% of these recommendations, and these really help us keep connected and keep moving and help our overall economy. The governor recommends $252 million in this area, in particular to repair local roads and bridges. The governor also recommends $80 million for high-priority trunk highway bridge projects, such as the bridge in this image, the Blotnick Bridge up in Duluth. And finally, $222 million for the Public Facilities Authority. And as you well know, that helps local communities address drinking water and maintain storm and wastewater infrastructure.
Commissioner, we have a question from Representative Hanson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I know transportation is coming, but I'm just wondering if the Lafayette Bridge untanglement or is in there, or if that's any planning or.
Commissioner Showalter.
Mr. Chair, Representative, I'm going to have MnDOT respond to that as to how it fits into the recommendations.
Please proceed.
The next slide just hits the other 2% of the recommendation, which is funds for bond sale expenses, other financing that just wasn't included in the other 5 categories. That would include user financing requirement for Ramp F's debt service in order to provide financial relief to the Department of Administration's parking fund. And so to Representative Hanson's earlier question about how to remove and how the change in use of office space, that speaks directly to that. It also includes funds for DEED and Met Council and DNR and public safety to administer local grants in the capital budget. Moving forward, I'm gonna just talk about the financing of these recommendations. To summarize, we've got $1.9 billion in general obligation bonds and $1.4 billion made up from other funds such as appropriation bonds, trunk highway bonds, general fund cash, and totaling an amount of $3.3 billion. As this slide shows you, these different financing tools are sort of comprise that total amount, and each of them is really tailored towards the needs that are being used for. General obligation bonds have very strict and defined uses, and so those are really appropriate for some projects, whereas cash or trunk highway bonds are appropriate for other projects. And so as the committee looks forward, just know that each of these is really different and appropriate for certain uses and not appropriate for other uses. The governor's recommendations include $119 million less in GO bonds and $602 million more in general fund cash when compared to where we were in 2022. And this is really to stay within the debt capacity guidelines. The major drivers of this are the governor's released budget included $40 million in Rural Finance Authority loans and $50 million in trunk highway bonds for IIJA match. Both impact the debt capacity guidelines. And in general, all these projects cost more than they did last year. So as I started this whole presentation talking about inflation, the whole package just costs more. And so we had to, when we're bumping up into our debt guidelines, we had to find a different way to bridge that cost, and that bridge is really the cash that we included in these recommendations. Moving ahead, the debt service costs for bonds do extend beyond the next biennium. So know that this is a long-term investment. But this table shows the biennial impact of the governor's recommendations to the general fund and the trunk highway fund. General fund shows the cost above the November forecast, which assumed an $880 million bonding bill this session based on a 10-year historic average. The general fund impact is $957 million this biennium and $186 million next. Why is it so much in the front end? Well, it's because of those cash projects that I mentioned before. The trunk highway fund impact is $22 million this biennium and $30 million next biennium. There's no questions on these numbers. move ahead. The state's debt capacity guidelines help us to sort of guide our capital investment decisions. As I mentioned before, these are long-term decisions, so these guidelines give us a sense of where we're at. The first two measures show existing authorized debt against state personal income, and the third measures how quickly the state pays down its debt. The first two guidelines would permit a $3.5 billion package based on the state's strong personal income figures. However, to meet guideline 3, by paying down debt quickly and preserving long-term debt capacity, Governor is recommending a GO bonding package of about $2 billion. The recommendations, all of these, the Governor's recommendations are within all three of these debt guidelines and preserve the ability to continue this program that happens in good years and bad budget years, high inflation years and low inflation years. It really is a program to make sure that we continue to invest in this infrastructure of the state. Comparing where we're at versus other states, this slide just gives you a sense that the state has moderate debt levels compared to the other 50 states, as reviewed and reported by our rating agencies. You'll see here that Minnesota is the 22nd lowest in terms of debt service to revenues when compared to other states. Again, the state has a moderate debt level compared to other states, this time looking at total debt compared to personal income. Passage of the governor and lieutenant governor's recommendations today would not materially change how these debt levels compare to other states as well. Sometimes one thinks that, oh, this bonding bill is going to move us way up the line or way down the line. These are fairly stable and really assume that all states are continuing to proceed making these kinds of investments. As always, we have plenty of more materials. Information for the governor's recommendations are on the mn.gov website /MMB under the budget category. Includes a listing of all the projects, summary descriptions of them, and further breakout for the committee in its consideration. With that, Mr. Chair, that concludes my prepared presentation. Happy to take any questions.
Representative Erdahl.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Commissioner Showalter. Just wondering, you have the governor's new bonding proposals here. We are, as you are aware, because you're doing it with us, working on the bill that we did the framework of a year ago. Now I just wonder about duplication. For example, you had in the new proposal $20 million for flood mitigation. If by chance in the bill that's being prepared we complete and passes, and if there were $20 million in there for flood mitigation, would that mean that that would then supplant what's here or substitute what's here? Would the new 20 million go away, and then would you put another one? How would that work?
Commissioner Showalter.
Mr. Chair, Representative, a great question. And how the legislature wants to pass bills, whether last year, this year, in multiple bills, is really your choice. We're seeking, for instance, in that case, $20 million for that purpose. We've got a long list of priorities. I'm trying to walk through those. And, if they happen right away, or if they happen at the end of session, means either one is good, as long as they happen, because we're really seeking funding at these levels for these programs. So to your question, if we were able to get some of these appropriations and projects moving right away, that's awesome. That would reduce the amount that the governor is seeking for other projects.
Representative Erdahl.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Commissioner, thank you for that. That was my follow-up question was going to be, then does that help the total to be reduced? And you answered that, so thank you.
Representative Lilly.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Commissioner, so I've been asking about the, the increased costs and that sort of thing. So, and you mentioned material and labor, and having been on this committee for a few years, former Chair Hausman often said that there was cost related to not passing bills in just strictly financial, costing more with like Moody's and other things. So if we are we seeing anything in regards to our bond rating or real cost of money, just that alone?
Commissioner Showalter.
Mr. Chair, Representative, great question. There's a lot going on there.
Sorry.
And certainly Assistant Commissioner Jen Hassemer can comment or follow up later. There's a couple of things going on. Since we met last, one good thing is we've been upgraded to AAA. So, we have what I would say is reached the appropriate level of credit ratings, where all three credit rating agencies say that Minnesota is among the best. Because of our debt portfolio, because of our long-term outlook, because of our sort of patient, appropriate, sort of serious, long-term management of capital investments and the risks that come around it. On the other hand, interest rates have gone up. So, to your question, the interest rate environment is very different than it was just a year ago. Right now, I believe the interest rates for these types of bonds would be above 4%, where a couple of years ago it would be more like, or a year ago it'd be more on 2%. So those things change. And as I mentioned, even at the release of the governor's budget a year ago, we should be doing it regardless of the interest rate. We can't guess what the interest rate's gonna be in August, but we can decide what our needs are, move on a long-term process and make sure that we're appropriate. So there are some costs. Absolutely, the delay has cost us some. And, but hopefully right now the interest rates are not gonna keep on going up.
Representative Lilly.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and Commissioner, thank you. It's always good to hear that our bond rating is doing so well. And so I have another quick question, if that's all right, Mr. Chair. So if, given you showed like the assets and the kind of the quality or the where buildings are at, good, fair, excellent, all that. If we were to get crazy and go to Connecticut level, in Connecticut, do they have roofs falling down still, or are they, what happens in Connecticut or Hawaii or these other states? If we were to push beyond and just, fully fund these for, say, the next 5 years, which I think we can with good leadership that we have going now. So,
Commissioner Showalter.
Chair, Representative, I'll start an answer. If Mary Ann has anything to add, we'll go there. I mean, I think a couple of things here. One is, I'm sure they still have some bad roofs. But I think the important thing here is how we direct our funds, how we sort of continue on a regular basis. Because it's not just the authorization level, it's actually the ability to execute and get it done. So the materials, the labor, the planning, all of those things are real constraints. And so this is a kind of a problem on the asset preservation that we're just gonna need to address routinely with diligence and consistency over a period of time. I don't think even if we borrowed a whole lot or authorized a huge chunk, we wouldn't really be able to use it. Because this is the kind of thing that it's gonna take a time to whittle away at.
Representative Lilly.
thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Commissioner.
Members, any additional questions for Commissioner Showalter before we move on? Seeing none, thank you, Commissioner.